Well, this week has been a trip, hasn't it? From QAnon supporters trying to figure out what their life is like now that their favorite reality TV show has ended, to Marvel fans scratching their heads at Wandavision. It feels like confusion and misunderstanding is in the air. In the age of misinformation, it has certainly become commonplace for fandoms to be completely divided over strange political divisions and misunderstandings. Some of these misunderstandings have become such an issue that they have changed how we interact with the content as a whole. And tonight we're going to dive right into the heart of that. Let's start off with the world of video games. In my opinion, the generational gap between gaming generations versus the non-gaming generations has led to a lot of controversy. And honestly, Fox News has a lot to do with it. From the sex controversies of Mass Effect to the outrage about violence in video games that eventually led to the video game rating system, Fox News has always been on the front lines of leading boomers astray when it comes to understanding video games and their place in the world. The controversy over Rockstar's game Bully is a great example of this. Bully is a game about attempting to survive in Bullworth Academy, where you were thrown into the same sort of hierarchical public school structure that millions of us endure every day. Fox News accused it of glorifying bullying, but it was actually quite the opposite. Your character actually worked with various factions to gain the upper hand on bullies, and the bullies themselves in the game were portrayed as toxic idiots. So, how influential is the Fox News generation in the misunderstanding of video games, Jake?
Yeah, well, I mean, Fox News itself is pretty big in the in the whole game of changing video games as it would. Their coverage of Mass Effect 2 ended up having the developers even completely pull out their LGBT kind of friendly relationships, and and it wasn't until Mass Effect 3 was the first time that they introduced non cis relationships into the game itself. And they even called Mass Effect a sex simulator, even though there was no nudity in any of the relationships.
Yeah.
And so, and we know Fox News and the news in general, to be honest, especially in the 90s at one point, was all a craze with just how much video games were destroying the youth's brains, right? And so, even though there are tons of examples of beautiful video games, but like you said, Bully's a great example of one that was just completely taken out of context, and that Fox News and other things covered, constantly trying to tear it down and say that it was, something that it wasn't. I'll give them, GTA, right? If they, I don't think they really misunderstand the point of GTA. Don't get me wrong. Grand Theft Auto does some amazing storytelling, but it is a game for adults, right? And I know we're going to talk about the whole age thing a little later, but it's just one of those where as an adult, it's this nothing worse than a Tarantino film that you just get to play through, right? And so, but yeah, no, Fox News and that whole generation really has misunderstood video games the whole time because they only grew up with, say, there was nothing to really misunderstand about Pong, but there are things to misunderstand about advanced storytelling,
Yeah, absolutely. Bronwyn, how influential do you find the Fox News generation in the misunderstanding of video games?
I think they totally misunderstand it. I think that it is just they put everything in one box. Video game has just no point in society, no positive role, and so they kind of try to find anything about a certain game and blow it completely out of proportion in terms of violence or sexuality or a lot of the more graphic, more adult games. They don't even take the time to really understand what's going on or to sort of to think that what are you showing on the news, what's happening in media altogether, and why is this all just being this one mode of one source of content is not okay, but all these other ones are. And I think that they just aren't out of that box, and it's completely misunderstood. No one's taking the time to actually try to see the benefits, the problem-solving skills that come from certain games, or the dexterity, or the community, the social aspects, all these positives that are in a game, even something violent in a game, get over it. There's still all these great aspects of it too, and just closed-mindedness.
Yeah, it's video games as a whole are almost misunderstood,
No, I agree.
To some,
I think that Brahman has a good point though with the graphic side of video games, because the graphic side of video games has always been heavily misunderstood. First, there's the myth about violent video games cause violence in people or glorifies violence, and we know that that's just a myth. I mean, like there's been plenty of different studies where researchers have gone in and tested kids that were avid gamers, gave them a gun, and started shooting, and they start crying because they don't know what recoil is. They don't understand, and certainly it's one thing to end a digital pixel life, and it's another thing to actually end actual life. Nevertheless, after Columbine, misunderstandings about the impact about violent video games changed the world by forever introducing a rating system. Arguably, this could be seen as a good thing, right? We don't want 5-year-old kids buying, God of War, right? But with that said, how many of us, owned GTA before the age of 18? How effective are these systems, and are they arguably a good thing or a bad thing, Bronwyn?
So I don't think the systems are super effective. I mean, I was the youngest child in my family. I had 2 older brothers, so it's like whatever games they were getting, I was playing. It didn't really matter. The rating system didn't really matter to, like, in terms of me. But I think it's good that they have them in place. I feel like it all sort of comes down to like your parents growing up. Like my mom would be like going and buying like the M-rated games for my brothers. Like, okay, whatever. So it's sort of like that is like the gatekeeper when you're of that certain age. It's really just up to your parents at that point. I know there are workarounds too, like maybe you're playing in your friend's basement, but kids will be kids. I don't think that it's going to inherently traumatize somebody playing a more mature video game.
Yeah.
So to answer your question, I think these rating systems don't really, they aren't really strictly enforced. But I do think that they have some validity because they are kind of a gauge for people to understand what they're getting into in a certain game. What about you, Jake?
Yeah, I mean, no, I would definitely say that, they arguably could be seen as a good thing, right? Our movies have ratings, and it's good to let people know before they buy something. If you put a mature label on something and your mom decides that you're mature enough to play it, then, that's kind of your parents' decision, right? And they're your guardian. So in a way, like,
right.
It's kind of like, it's really just on them. And of course, like you said, kids are going to be kids. They're going to find workarounds. I mean, shit, nowadays, like they can probably like emulate something, like there's no telling, like, especially if you got a really smart kid on a PC, they're going to play whatever game they want to play. They'll sail the high seas and get that bad boy for free. And so it's one of those where, like people are definitely going to play games. I know I was playing games that were for mature at a less than mature age, right?
Right.
But it really goes back to the myth of the, video games being violent in the first place. America does have its problems with guns, but and every time somebody tries to blame that on a video game, I think one of the best arguments is, oh yeah, forget we're the only country with video games.
Right.
Because like video games aren't just an American exclusive. Like we're not the only ones with the power to get that DLC, baby. Like,
but we are the only ones with these kind of gun problems. And so I see your point. Yeah. It's not. This is certainly not an issue that is particularly a uniquely American issue. I mean, like Japan and even New Zealand, they still play video games as well, and they have significantly less gun crimes than we do. You're going to really compare us to Japan as far as video game consumption? Come on now, like, come on.
No, it's not even close. Like, and there's places like South Korea, where when certain games come out, they will see the nation's GDP drop because so many people take off work to play the games. And so it's one of those things where, like, there's gaming is big in a lot of other countries and a lot of other cultures. And so it hasn't led to much violence around the world, right? Like you would think with video games being a global thing, with how much money they make, Red Dead made more than almost like any movie of all time, I think, right?
Right.
And it's a pretty violent game at times with some pretty violent tones and, things and crimes and shooting shit. And so, you would think with something that sold that much directly afterwards, we would have seen a huge increase in violent crime, right?
Yeah.
But we didn't, and so it's one of those where, like, there's really, to me, there's no correlation here. I'm pretty sure there's been studies done that show there's no correlation there.
Oh, many.
And so, it's one of those where, like, I would definitely agree ratings should be a thing because we have them on movies. That's no big deal.
Right.
But like, arguing that the violence in video games causes overall violence in a culture, that's just out there too much.
Yeah. And, video games certainly aren't the only misunderstood content, though. Recently, Marvel's Punisher has been circulating around the news. Even a few new comments from John Barenthal himself. But they've got nothing to do with the new series coming up, but rather the fact that domestic terrorists who raided the Capitol were wearing his logo on their chest. Let's get one thing straight. Frank Castle would execute every single one of these guys on sight, all right? He does not like cops, and he certainly does not like bootlickers, which is exactly why he left the force. Hence ACAB, because good cops don't stay cops, okay? But I digress. Captain America has had a similar trouble with nationalists as well. Are widespread misunderstandings of these characters the faults of their creators, Jake?
Ooh, I mean, that is a good question. But no, I think it's the fault of the people reading the content. They didn't obviously read the source, right? Or if they did, they didn't understand it. And that's why it made it to this conversation. I think Punisher is an awesome example of that. And same with Captain America, where people look at Cap as this beacon of American amazingness. And yeah, he may have been that, back in the heyday. But he's always fought, fascism. He's fought against Nazis, and things like that. He's never said Nazis were good people. That there were good people on both sides of Nazis.
Exactly.
And so, and like you said, Frank Castle left the force for a reason. He thought cops were dirty. But yet you see all these cops with, Punisher logos on their cars. And that says a lot, too. Because it's one of those where, okay, so you, who are paid by the taxpayer, believe that you should resort to vigilante justice, in your free time? Or why I'm getting paid? What does that even say?
Yeah.
Because the Punisher looked at himself as, obviously the Punisher. He was the judge and the jury and the executioner. And there's a reason why he was I think top 3 would dead in most kills on the Marvel list.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it's just, that's not who your police force should inspire to be, right? They shouldn't
they shouldn't be inspired by
protect and serve, not protect and slaughter. You know what I mean? That's not the whole And so it's very bizarre that that's become a beacon, but I don't think that it being misunderstood is the fault of Vader, right?
Yeah.
I think it's really just the fault of most of those people who rock Punisher stuff on their shit. They've only seen a shitty Punisher movie.
Right.
They haven't read the comics. They don't know the backstory. And so it's not the creator's fault. It's really, I mean, it may be the creator of those movies, but it's not the creator's fault at its core. It's really, just how the person, really takes the medium, if they are the media, if they have ever even taken a chance to read it, which I would wager many of them haven't.
I see. I get you. Brahma, what do you think? Is this are widespread misunderstandings about these characters the fault of the creator?
I don't think so. I agree with Jake. I think that it's in the hands of the consumer at that point to interpret that information how they want to. And I feel like a lot of times people will feel a certain kinship to a character or feel like they represent something that's important to them and kind of latch on to that, and then use that to kind of be a part of their movement or a symbol for that movement because they relate in a certain aspect. So yeah, the creators are maybe creating relatable characters, which is something that you aspire to do. That can be taken too far, especially if people are so far on one end that they just almost pull those over that way. I think you could also argue a little bit, not really creator's fault, but maybe, in terms of Captain America, just looking back at the character himself, he was propaganda. That's why he was created as a tool of propaganda. So you can sort of see that, but they're drawing awareness to it. So I feel like he breaks away from that role, but maybe it is just some whole elaborate propaganda scheme. I don't know.
I've done a lot of research on Captain America. I wrote a 25-page paper on Captain America when I was in college, and I really, through my studies, have found him to be what I believe a thermometer of American patriotism. And at the time when he came out, he was absolutely propaganda, but that was absolutely what was needed to be sold. They were trying to sell war bonds. And Captain America was literally a character, even in the comics, that was made to sell war bonds. And so it was a very altruistic character throughout. And so but I get your point, Brahman. Your point still stands, which is that it was propaganda originally. And now nationalists taking that banner, well, what do you expect when you've given them propaganda? So I think that there is a degree of that there should be taken into account. Now, I also think that you should take into account where that character has gone since then. And I think that, most modern reflections of, per se, Captain America has been him turning his back on the government when the government wasn't doing the right thing. And if you don't look at those things, and you're not looking at it altruistically, just the same way that people that misinterpret the Punisher are doing. Now, that doesn't mean that I'm going to wear a Punisher shirt out in public because of what the implications of what people might think that means. Rick and Morty played with the idea of controversy in a very meta way. In the episode Prometheus, Rick and Morty got in hot water over with fans over a 9/11 joke, or so the New York Post puts it. The funny thing about that is that they didn't actually do it. If you watch the episode, the joke of the episode was that they didn't do a 9/11 because they were quote unquote classy. And misunderstandings like that actually do play into the hands of the audience, the people that are smart enough to get Rick and Morty, or however you want to put it. It's entertaining when the media kind of bites in the way that Rick and Morty is kind of baiting them to bite. So can sparking fake controversies through misunderstandings actually be a useful marketing technique, Bronwyn?
Yeah, definitely. It's the whole saying, like, any publicity is good publicity. You want to get people's attention. It's been used as a marketing tool, I feel like, forever. And is it the most kosher one? No, but it definitely is a useful one.
That's fair. I think that. Jake, what do you think about that? Can sparking fake controversy through misunderstanding be a useful marketing technique?
Oh yeah, no, I mean Bronwyn nailed it. It's useful. I don't know if it's the most kosher, but it's useful. Like
right.
One of my favorite stories, and this is not to give a Jake story time, but essentially like is Tucker Max, who was a big like kind of like male chauvinist artist back in the day, right? Like now I think he helps people write books, but he had a PR guy, publicist, that wrote this whole book called "Trust Me, I'm Lying." And that book changed my life because the dude talked about some of the crazy techniques they use behind the scenes to get publicity on things. Like one time they vandalized one of Tucker Max's, the guy who put up the billboard vandalized the billboard, then took photos of him the vandalized billboard, sent them to the media, and said that this feminist group vandalized Tucker's billboards because they hated him coming to town to speak at this thing. And so then the media blew up about it in that local area, and it caused them to sell out tickets. And it was all because they faked vandalizing their own billboard and then talking to the media about it. And so people do this kind of stuff like all the time. I don't necessarily know if that's what Rick and Morty did. I think the New York Post is kind of like a hype. They write about bullshit all the time. And so they were probably like talking about, you know. I love it when these when the media says like, people are outraged, and it's like three tweets, Right. It'll be like 3 tweets.
I get that, and that's exactly why when I wrote this, I was like, or so the New York Post puts it.
Yeah, exactly. They'll be like, they always say something like, like the internet exploded with anger, and it'll be like 2 people who are like, I don't appreciate Rick and Morty making a 9/11 joke. And like you said in the episode, they're like, yeah, no, that was a miss. Like we would never make that joke. Like,
we wouldn't make that joke. They did a Pearl Harbor instead. Don't know if that's really that much better, but the funny part about the New York Post article is they say it's a 9/11 joke. They categorically did not do a 9/11 joke.
Yeah,
like
no.
that was the whole point of the joke. But some media is just intentionally made to be hard to understand, right? Many Christopher Nolan / Stanley Kubrick films fall into this category. Inception's a great example. The biggest debate in the film is whether Dom was in a reality or a dream the whole time, if you remember correctly. The scene cuts to black at the very, very end with the totem spinning, and you never get the real answer. But as frustrating as that may be, it doesn't actually matter. Dom is already leaving the room. The whole symbology of the moment there is that it's subjective whether or not this reality is the reality or fictional. And so the whole fact of whether or not we're asking the question of whether or not it's a dream or it's not a dream is kind of what Christopher Nolan's trying to poke fun at in the beginning. or sorry, in the ending of it. But it symbolizes that the acceptance of the reality is subjective, which is the whole point of the scene. Even if you could know the answer, would you really even want to? With it said, movies like this draw debate. Is this a good circumstance where misunderstanding can actually be advantageous, Jake?
Oh man, Nolan's best at this, right? Like, because he even did it with the Batman movies, where you're just like, like, oh, was he in France with Catwoman, or is he dead? Like what happened? But like, it's just, I think these movies that kind of like try to, draw some sort of symbolism that kind of like get people talking about them. I mean, it's interesting that, like, it's almost like, do they do that because the art, like the director or the artist or whatever, like that's just kind of their style. That's what they want to do. They want to leave you kind of like wondering or wanting for more, right? Or is it a part of the marketing? But I don't know. Like, I think, it's definitely a case where, misunderstanding, like, sometimes it's hard to understand the meaning of those movies, but that's part of the adventure of the movie, right? Like, I don't think we're even supposed to understand them sometimes. And I think that's the big thing that a lot of people miss, is that, like, not everything that somebody creates is supposed to give you a nice bow on the end, kind of a thing, right? And but I think most people really yearn for that, and that's kind of how our brains are set up anyway. Like, we need to have closure as humans, right? And so, like, that's what makes it hard to have one of those Nolan style, like, cliffhanger endings. And it's one of those. Then that's why it gets everybody talking.
Yeah. Brahman, what do you think? With that said, movies can draw debate. Is it circumstances where misunderstanding actually advantageous? Do those exist?
Yeah, I really like this as a technique. I like to question an ending you're forced to look at something from two different perspectives, which I really like because we don't do that enough in our lives. We often get really bogged down in what we think and what we feel. So having an ending like that allows you to sort of question where it's coming from. It spurs discussion, which I think is a really amazing part of the movie going experience, is that, like, after the movie, talking to your friends about it, doing what we're doing now, like things like that. And to be able to kind of like argue your sides of the story, I think is really cool. I also always wonder if the director even knows themselves. Maybe they don't. And that's pretty cool too, because maybe they're also kind of like towing this line where they're seeing it from both sides. Maybe like one day they feel it could end this way, and the other day they could feel it could end that way. So yeah. And I think it's a good move.
When looking at misunderstood media, one of the top was Lost. And I thought that was funny because, like, I don't even think the directors know what the fuck the ending of Lost meant. So,
right.
Exactly. And with our lives too, we don't know what's going on. We don't know the meaning of anything. So why should our media tell us what the meaning is? What is going on? Yeah. I don't know.
To circle back to Rick and Morty, none of this makes sense. Let's go watch TV.
Right, for real. The most common and frequent misinterpretation in almost any media is who or what is being glorified, right? Frequently, people forget that Walter White is a criminal, right? Like, he absolutely got what he deserved, right? Mad Men and The Wolf of Wall Street aren't meant to be role models for young professional men, especially the yuppies in Austin. But many of them would beg to differ. Rick is a fucking asshole and an alcoholic. Again, not a role model, all right?
Bad guy.
This bleeds into how we interact with the fandom as a whole. I love the Punisher, but I won't wear a t-shirt with his logo on it in public because of the implications. How do misunderstandings about content affect how you interact with them, Brahman?
Well, we've been talking about Rick and Morty a bit. I know we mentioned this in one of our earlier streams, how like that toxic fandom and how that kind of having that muddies the experience for the rest of you. So it's like you are kind of put in this like group of people that are so I think that it does impact it. It does make you maybe not want to show your like, oh, I love this show, I'm gonna like wear a shirt about this every day, but you can still enjoy that, and you can still I don't think it really affects the way that you like personally consume something, but maybe it affects the way that you broadcast that to the rest of the world. But also people can just throw that out the window and still, I mean, I still wear Rick and Morty shirts. I still will walk out the door like that. I know it's not quite so dramatic as of an example, like you said, The Punisher, which is something that, I mean, I don't even know The Punisher that well, so I wouldn't go off advertising that I do. But I definitely think that groups of people will affect the way that the media is looked at. And then you're just going to have to either deal with that or not represent that media. So whether you want it to or not, it is impacting the way that other people perceive you. So it's just up to you to either care or not care.